So welcome. Thank you for remembering. We shifted the time. We would always normally do this on an hour earlier, but we thought let's take advantage of the lunch hour, especially now as things are starting to get back to normal. And like you said, in-person meetings are happening more and more. And so we still want to have this. This is just such a great opportunity for us to come together as a district and be able to get you all resources and things that can hopefully be helpful to you. So thank you for being a part of this. And let me start with a word of prayer, and then we'll dive right in. God, thank you so much for the men and women that are gathered here on this call. Thank you for the churches that are represented by everyone here, and for the work that you've done, how you've sustained us through this most challenging, difficult time. We've learned a lot. We've grown a lot, and we've learned that you are still God. You are still King. And there's nothing that can possibly happen that can thwart your plan. So God, today, as we talk about money and finances, God, may it be glorifying to you. May you open up our hearts, our minds to think of how we can use this resource of money more for your glory, and that we can discover things that maybe we haven't discovered. And in the process, may more people come to know you through just better management of resources. And that you would bring peace to some of our hearts too. I know maybe there's some on this call that are worried and stressed about the future and providing for their families. It's hard to do that in ministry a lot of times. And so I pray that this would be a welcome blessing also. So we thank you and give you the glory in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
Well, I want to jump right in. We introduce our guest today. And so I think our plan is we'll have a time where there'll be a presentation, and then we'll have some time for Q&A at the end. But I'm really grateful. One of the great things about being a part of EFCA is access to the various resources and expertise that we have. And one of those is an organization called FCMM. And they deal with for pastors, helping with retirement and investments and all kinds of things, and other financial advice. And so we are grateful to have Jerry Rich with us, who is the vice president of FCMM, and coming at us from Minneapolis, from our home office there. So Jerry, I'm just going to turn it over to you, and you can take it away.
Very good. So I'll first fiddle around here and make sure I'm sharing the screen with you properly. I think you should be seeing it now, the title screen. And the nature of what we're going to talk about is such, or the way we're going to do it rather than being in a room together, makes it a little more difficult for questions along the way. So I'm going to ask that for the next 25 minutes or so, make note of any questions you have while I mention things, and then we'll have ample time for Q&A after that. I'm supposed to be talking about retirement planning, but I have to tell you that's not a term that I use very often. By the way, a couple of you could do this, I think. Kelly or Dave McMartin, you could be presenting this workshop today. But anyway, thanks for sitting in. And I do hope that you'll also find opportunity of some things that I may share, or that you think about, that you would think of sharing with younger pastors, younger church staff members who often aren't thinking about this. And this is the time that they can make the biggest difference in what they do by giving attention to some of these things. So I mentioned I don't really use the word retirement. Basically we have this deal in America. We used to talk about pensions and retiring on a pension and living on the golf course after that. But frankly, it's even simpler than that. All we're talking about is like Joseph did during the abundant years in Egypt, putting away some of what he produced, what the land produced in those years, so they could draw on it in the years that it wasn't producing as much. That's really all we're talking about. How am I going to provide for my future income when I no longer have an employer giving me regular income, at least not at the level to which you become accustomed? Beyond that, we're all over the map on what, quote, retirement is, whether it's rehirement or refreshment or work till I die preaching in the pulpit or whatever our plans are there. Almost all of us are going to reach a time when we have to draw on some resources we put away. So let's acknowledge that that's really all we're talking about. There. So just quickly, the commercial part of this, or putting it in perspective, FCMM, we're in our 50th anniversary. We're part of the Free Church. We're in the national office, although we're technically separately incorporated, and that's a best business practice for the protection of the retirement assets and for the protection of the denomination. So we focus on helping churches provide benefits to their staff. The three main things we do is our retirement plan, our benefit plan, which is long-term disability insurance. And I would urge you, if you don't have disability insurance in place, that's another responsible thing to do. Or if you're representing a church board of elders, it really protects both the church and the individual. If you have a staff member who becomes disabled, most churches feel some level of responsibility, and some churches have helped former staff for years because they had nothing. Well, the best way you can do it is to give them into disability insurance, especially through our program, which is geared for churches. And then you protect both the church and the individual for the future. Then the church has the opportunity to know that that staff member is taken care of and that they don't have an ongoing responsibility there. And finally, we in recent years have launched a payroll service, and we have about 50 free churches in our payroll service, which is bundled with the benefit plan. But let's move along. Our motto is prepare today, ready tomorrow. Again, that's really all we're talking about. And here are the things that I want to share with you today. Three areas: funding my retirement or my post-employment life, why use FCMM as retirement plan, and then I do want to touch on this matter of opting out of Social Security. Many young pastors, even to this day, consider that, and I want to give you some of my thinking about it anyway. And maybe you'll have reason, if you're engaged with somebody who's considering that, to either talk with them about it or refer them to some of our resources. And then we will have ample time for Q&A. So, as I mentioned, planning for retirement is simply putting some of our assets away now to draw on in future years. And I've heard some people say that they don't find retirement in the Bible. Actually, they may be using the wrong translation, the NIV. It's there in Numbers 8. Notice the Levites at the age of 50 must retire from their regular service. And then they were reassigned to other duties and weren't quite as demanding. Remember, they were the ones who erected the tabernacle and took it down and did all that heavy lifting. So there's at least some hint in the Bible that some of us will have reason to restructure our duties as we get older, and as our longevity increases, we particularly have to deal with that. Now, I've sometimes heard pastors say, well, my retirement plan is just to keep preaching till I die. And I agree that all of us are called to a lifetime of ministry, but for most of us, the time will come when our abilities are more limited, or when the church decides we're not their person anymore to lead the church full time. And so we need to be ready to provide for that and do the funding now while we have opportunity to. So here's the question: how will we support ourselves in those years after employment? And there's three simple rules that I see. One is start to contribute early to some type of retirement funds, and we'll get into that. Contribute regularly. Try not to have gaps in them, and then contribute at increasing rates so that as you receive raises and all, you head towards a goal of an increased portion going into your retirement account. Now, the government has helped us here. Let me back up. We could just save and put money in a savings account, pay taxes on the interest for that, and that would be our savings. Most of us aren't quite disciplined well enough for that, but we also have an understanding with the government that favors us putting away money for retirement, and so there are some vehicles that do that. There are employer retirement plans or individual retirement accounts, and the basic trade-off here is recognizing the value of its citizens putting away. Our government has said, we won't tax you on that money yet. Someday you'll pay tax, but you don't have to now. In fact, you lower your current taxable income, and then someday when you start drawing it, you'll pay tax on it. Now, there is a reverse wrinkle of that called a Roth designation, where you can do the opposite. But the point is, your earnings aren't taxed currently, and eventually, then you get to take advantage of that incentive you had to put away. Here are some rules of thumb that I've seen that are the most important. One is when we're planning for what we're going to need, most of us need about 75% of our pre-retirement income. And all of these things that I'll mention are general rules of thumb, and your particular circumstances may be different. And the difference, whether we enter our post-employment years with debt. In fact, you know, there's an increasing number of retirees who still owe college loans and are still paying on them. Whether we own a house, what our financial and health history has been like through our lives. So all of us come at this with different circumstances, but in general, we need 75%. And for most people, about half of that would come from what we've accumulated to put away, and maybe up to a third of it from Social Security. Now, for many people of modest means, including many in ministry, it's more like 50-50 or even greater for Social Security making up a portion of it. So again, these are just general rules of thumb. So we need to try to think in terms of providing maybe 3/4 of our salary in our retirement years, in our post-employment years. So how do we know what to aim for? Some studies put this out there, that on these decades, that by age 35, we should have accumulated 1 times our annual salary in our retirement funds, which of course we don't touch. By 45, 3 times. And you can see up to age 65, 8 times. Now, this is all well and good, but frankly, most people in ministry have not had opportunity to make this kind of accumulation. You know, I hope that you will have some opportunity. And of course, Fidelity Investments, who did this study, want to put the maximum number out there. But I will say that most of us in ministry have learned to live with modest means. And so by wise use of our assets and not having profligate spending, we may not have to achieve these goals, the more important goal that I would share with you that we can all wrap our heads around is strive to put 15% of our income away in retirement funds during our 40-year career. If anybody's been to Financial Peace University, what does Dave Ramsey say? 15%. What do most financial planners say? They urge about 15%. At one time, this was 10 and 12%, but in more recent years, it's been revised upwards to focus on what the studies show is actually needed. Now, how many of us, when we were age 25, started putting 15% away? Probably no one in this workshop today. And again, this is a rule of thumb, but we need to come pretty close to this, somewhere in the 10 to 15% range, I believe. And to our benefit, the retirement accounts that the IRS approves, including FCMM's retirement account, have catch-up provisions where after age 50, you can put in a larger amount, because we are limited to a certain amount of contribution each year, according to the IRS. I like to keep this 15% in mind and have it as a goal that we strive towards. One of the ways of getting there over time is when we get a raise, taking an increment of that raise and adding that to our retirement contribution. So when I mention contribute at an increasing rate, let's say I get a 3% raise. It's a good practice for me to put a third of that, 1% more into my retirement plan. And over the years, get myself closer and closer to the 15%. So topic 2 for today, why would we encourage using FCMM retirement plan? Well, of course, I have a vested interest in that. But besides that, when I first went to a free church in 1989, that free church participated in FCMM, which at that time was only for pastors who were in the Ministerial Association. But it's an employer plan, which I'll get to in a moment, that has additional benefits for us to participate in versus simply doing it on our own. But we're designed to recognize the autonomous nature of free churches. So no church is required to participate in the FCMM retirement plan. About somewhere close to 3/4 do, and those who don't may have other reasons or are too small or have a part-time leadership. But we're designed so that each employer can make their own decisions. So I want to quickly mention what the advantages are versus any other sort of plan that a church could do. And one big one for ministers and missionaries is that, do you know, not only is your contribution deferred from current income tax, but also the way it works, the way ministers are paid, you don't pay the SECA tax, the Social Security tax, on the amount that you have deducted as salary deferral, or that the employer gives as an employer benefit. So the avoidance of the SECA tax on your retirement contributions, which is only true for ministers and how their compensation is structured. And then when the time comes that you begin drawing that money for retirement, those distributions can be tax-free to the extent you use them for housing. Just like how housing allowance works in your active years, the IRS says that because this is deferred compensation, if it could have been housing allowance, but you deferred it instead, then it's housing allowance when you take it out. So the bottom line is, we keep track of all the ministers in our plan. As their contributions come in, we tag them as housing allowance eligible. So then when you begin to draw in retirement, you can use it tax-free to the extent you use it for your housing. That may lead to some different strategies, and we can talk about this in the Q&A regarding how aggressively you pay down your house. Different approaches here. It is important for me to give the disclaimer that the housing allowance is only a benefit as long as you live, as long as the pastor who was putting the money away lives. It doesn't go on to the spouse, but still, it's pretty good for those years. You've heard about individual retirement accounts, and I do have a slide on that in a moment. We have employer plans, and we have individual retirement accounts in the IRS approved retirement system. So a 403b9 plan like FCMM has higher limits than an IRA. So if you were saying, I'm just going to do this with an individual retirement account, your limit there is $6,000 a year plus $1,000 more catch up after age 50. Whereas in the retirement plan, like a 401k or a 403b, the limit is $19,500 and $6,500 catch up. You'll see those figures in a little bit. Those are advantages of being part of a retirement plan like ours. Also, the flexibility that we offer. A 401k is ERISA regulated and has fewer choices, and everybody has to be treated exactly alike. Church 403b plan, if your church needs to have higher levels for certain employees, like pastoral staff or full-time staff, you can have different levels of employer contribution for your staff. Again, that's only in a 403b church plan like FCMM's. We're simple. Rather than your church going out and forming a plan, we have the plan and the plan document, and the employer simply has a responsibility to stay within the contribution limits and to send them off to FCMM, and we handle all the rest rather than you having to pay a third-party administrator to do your retirement plan. And that leads to the fact that we're low cost to the church. There are no fees charged to the church. Our participants are the ones who, through a fee on their assets, pay for the administration of the plan, and we have modest fees on that compared to other plans. So how do all these retirement accounts shake out? I mentioned some of these. Let me just show you this outline. So there are the tax advantage plans, and then there are plans, there are things that aren't tax advantage, like our personal savings and all. Within the tax advantage plans, you have employer plans and individual plans. So individual is where you hear about the IRAs. Employer plans, the 401ks that we hear so much about, that's for for-profit companies. 403b is for companies that are like 501c3 organizations and churches. And within a 403b specifically, there's a 403b9 church plan that has all those benefits that I mentioned. So we are an employer plan, and sometimes have to work to have this fully understood, that the contributions can't be sent by the individual. They do have to be sent through the church. And the only way that the contributions can be sent is either for the employer, the church, to be making a contribution, or the individual to say, deduct so much from my salary and send it off. And it can be any combination of that. We do have to be the sole retirement plan of a church. There can't be multiple plans within a church, and that's due to some IRS regulations. Here's the total contributions that I mentioned. I won't comment more on that. I believe we have a copy of these slides in PDF form that are either already available to you or will be sent to you So I think I already talked enough about the housing allowance. So only a church plan can do housing allowance, not a 401k, not an IRA. And the same rules apply, you'll see in the smaller print on the slide there, as during your active years about what the limits are. So to clarify a little further, the source of contributions, each local church decides how they're going to do the contributions. So of all the free churches in FCMM, there are hardly any two alike on how they do their benefits on the retirement plan. And that again is an advantage of the multiple employer church plan like ours. So we handle all the administration, but the local church decides how they're going to do it. So the employer can commit to giving a certain percentage or a certain dollar amount as contribution, which does not get reported in the salary. In fact, it doesn't get reported anywhere, but it's subject to those limitations mentioned on the previous slide. An employee can contribute a percentage or a dollar amount. And this is called salary deferral. So you have the employer contribution, an employee contribution, and there are two flavors to an employee contribution, either the regular salary deferral that we call pre-tax, or the Roth designated deferral, which you pay your tax now. It doesn't lower your current income. And there's some strategies related to that, especially for pastors who have the benefit of housing allowance in retirement. And then thirdly, an employer can set up a matching where they say, if you contribute 5% through salary deferral, we'll match it with 5%. So those are the ways money gets into the plan, not by writing a check to us by the individual, but only through the church. Now, we have a lot of investment options, and the reason we do is for the reasons you see on this slide. There's some people who say, just do it for me. I don't want to have to choose the funds. Others say, help me do it. Others say, do it myself. So we have 4 different mutual fund families besides the funds that FCMM has. I'm not going to cover them here other than to mention them in groupings. We have funds that are managed by FCMM with a professional Morgan Stanley consulting firm. And we have a stock fund, a bond and income fund, and then a lifetime fund that's designed to be a steady kind that you can read about in our materials on our website. Then we have these mutual fund families that I mentioned, and we also have the opportunity to invest in, through Christian Investors Financial, the church loan organization of the Free Church. And about half of the investments come into options C, D, and E, the managed funds that FCMM manages, and especially for people who say, just do it for me. And then the do-it-yourselfers, particularly like the mutual funds, and many people are a combination of those. I'll let you read about the lifetime fund on your own. Again, its focuses on being steady and not being reflective of where the market is right now, but it's a long term that over a long period of time will approximate what you would get if you were in all the ups and downs of the market. This is one recommendation I make to people who are of the more do-it-for-me approach, to put half of their funds in our lifetime fund and then some split of the remainder. So quickly, you've heard that ministers can opt out of Social Security, and many have done it. Most often I hear the reason is to save money, not have to pay that Social Security tax. But the only real basis for opting out of Social Security is that you have a theological objection to receiving benefits, not even that you object to the tax, but that you say, I never want to take the benefits, and it should be a theological objection, not, oh, I think I can do better. There's a procedure for doing it that I've outlined here, and it has to be done within the first 2 years, and it's an irrevocable decision. Here are links to 2 articles on our website, articles that I wrote that delve into the issue more of what one would need to think about in opting out of Social Security. And then if one does, how to deal with it. But I mentioned these are reasons that are not valid for opting out. Your tax preparer told you you could do better. You don't think Social Security will be viable. I don't want to pay the tax. Or the one I hear the most is, I didn't know what I was doing. Somebody put this piece of paper in front of me, whether it was a tax accountant or another pastor, and said, here's a good deal, do this and you won't have to pay that SECA tax rate for Social Security. And it's also important, even though it's not an economic decision, to recognize what a person is opting out of, not just the retirement income, but survivor benefits, like for minor children, if you die early, spousal benefits that would never come the way of your spouse, particularly if she or he had not been employed enough to get Social Security. The disability coverage that's a part of it, although it's even better to have private disability insurance, and Medicare. A lot of people don't realize they're also opting out of having Medicare provided, and there may be benefits added in the future. Winding down here, I had a call from an executive pastor a few years ago who said, Jerry, how do I get unordained? And I said, well, why would you want to get unordained? He said, well, I got ordained in order to get the housing allowance. And I, wait, that's not a reason to get ordained. You know, you don't get ordained for tax benefits. We have a whole procedure related to that. But I think I know what happened there. You could start getting housing allowance, but your church never gave you the equivalent of what you were paying now as the SECA tax, the double rate for Social Security. And so, and I'll have one more slide that'll help make that more clear. So it's not that it's the greatest deal in the world, but the IRS says if the facts indicate that you're a minister, you need to be treated that way. You don't get to turn it on and off. So having to pay that double rate, what normally an employee pays 7.65% and an employer pays 7.65%, you're responsible as a minister for the whole 15.3% rate. And there's some ins and outs of how that's done. I mentioned this already. Here's a best practice that I encourage churches to do, and I advocate this anywhere I can go. I believe a church should pay the minister in salary the equivalent of what they would pay as an employer FICA. And that's a little more clear on this slide. So the regular employee, the employee has this much withheld and the employer has to pay this much. When you become classified as a minister, all of this becomes your responsibility. Now, I believe that a church recognizing that should go ahead and pay the minister an additional 7.65%, equivalent of this. That's what they will pay for non-clergy employees. And I think this is the only equitable thing to do. Let's say you had a youth pastor earning $50,000 and a youth director who's not a minister and not to be treated that way tax-wise paid the same amount. You're actually paying the clergy employee less if you're not giving this Social Security offset. It's taxable income, but I don't think it should be considered part of the base pay. So in that $50,000 example I was giving, you pay $50,000 as salary, you pay 7.65% as additional salary, just to equate to what you would pay for a FICA employee. Now, having said these things, I want to emphasize that whether it's through our all of our working years or in our post-employment years, God is still our provider. And each of us will come to that stage in life with different circumstances. Some of us may have had reversals along the way in employment, in family health, in a wayward child. Each of our circumstances will be unique, and none of us can proudly go around saying, I did this all right. That's where we can have some grace for one another. And I believe that God will still supply every need. But any younger person listening to me, I would say, well, don't focus so much on that. Focus on your responsibility. And so that's what we've been talking about here. I'd be glad to interact with you in the future in any ways that I can be of help. Also, take a look at our website for some resources, a couple of links I put in here. And I'm ready to slow down here. I'll take off my screen share and we can have some questions.
Great. Hey, thank you, Jerry. And incidentally, just to follow up, you will be each getting a PDF of this entire presentation. It'll have the links and Jerry's contact information and that sort of thing. So in our remaining time, please, actually, if you can either type questions in the chat or use the raise your hand feature. And if you know how to do that, and we can get questions. So go ahead. We're ready for you. Don't be shy. Okay, Dale's asking, what is the average return of FCMM managed funds?
So you notice we have 3 funds there. The stock fund, it's all due to the nature of what the fund is. We have all of that information available in the forms and documents section of our website. We have semi-annual reports on that. Our stock fund approximates what a general diversified fund would do. So yeah, it's not like a savings account where there's a percentage there. Our board decides each year what the lifetime fund is going to return. And again, the goal of that is to keep it steady. So I would refer you to the performance report that's available in the forms and documents section of our website. Okay, great. Dave Fandy, you have a question.
Hey, thanks very much. David Fandy from Carlsbad, California. Jerry, great job. Super thankful for you guys. I want to understand, did you say that on the employee contributions to the retirement plan, that part is not taxed with SECA? Is that what you said?
Yes, for the minister contributing, and it's due to the way that you're paid. So a regular FICA employee, they're paying Social Security regardless. You only pay your SECA tax as part of filing your 1040, and it doesn't count since you're not having it deducted from your pay. It's due more to the different way of reporting, but it has the effect of, not paying the SECA tax on your salary deferred contributions. Not your, if you do Roth, no, but your regular pre-tax contributions that you would make. That's one of those things that's kind of hidden to you, so you get it without realizing that you're having that benefit.
Okay, so Ray was asking, we might have been covered already, how this relates to a 403B. But you talked about the main thing I think is important is the difference between a 403B and the 403B9. I think it is, Jerry, that you said is there's a uniqueness to how the housing allowance is calculated.
Yeah. So Ray, if you already have a 403B, was that in a church that had a 403B plan of their own, or they participated in some other system?
Yeah, it was a church I was at before, and I can't
Yeah.
remember how it was set up, but it was set up in another church.
Yeah. So it depends on how, if it's truly a 403B and if it's declared to be a 403B church plan. So in one of my years of serving as an executive pastor, I went to a church that had a 401k that a financial advisor in the church had set up, and the church board didn't realize that that a 401k that was ERISA regulated was didn't have the flexibility of a 403b church plan, and we actually were paying administrative fees that were enormous in that large church unnecessarily. So back to the point, if that 403b that you're talking about is a church plan, then it would probably be similar. Like Guidestone has a 403b9 church plan, and there are others who operate ones, Clergy Advantage in Colorado and all. But it has to be properly designated as elected as a church plan in order to have these benefits. The other thing is, if you have a previous 403b or 401k for that matter, it is possible to roll over those funds into FCMM. All of the retirement plans cooperate with one another on this so that you can consolidate it presently. You have no reason you have to withdraw from that plan, but you have the opportunity if you want to roll over.
Is it, if I was to do that, are you able, do you have limitations on how much you can do per year, or can you just roll over the whole thing into it?
Rollovers, there's no limitation on. You might be thinking of Roth conversions or contributions, but no, for money that's already in a retirement plan to roll over to another one, there's no limit on that. It doesn't have to be stretched out or anything. And we cooperate with those. Usually you have to fill out paperwork for that retirement plan, paperwork with us, and then it eventually comes together. And and they send those funds directly to us. They don't go through you. So, it's not a taxable distribution.
Okay.
Is there a norm for how churches help staff prepare for retirement? Well, I can wish there was. The most important norm is just participating in some retirement plan for staff, which helps encourage them to be involved. But particularly about the level of contribution, as I mentioned, churches are all over the map. Some adopt FCMM, but don't feel that they can make an employer contribution. And so they set up their adoption agreement with FCMM to only be salary deferral. Pastor, if you want some money withheld and sent off to FCMM, we'll cooperate with doing that for you. And there's quite a number of churches that only do that. I like to see churches, though, get into an employer contribution. And again, free churches are all over the map. Some do a 10% employer contribution, some do a 3%, and some do a matching contribution. And I particularly like matching contributions because it helps encourage the personal responsibility. Now, if I take the 15% that I mentioned, one of the best ways to get there that I would like to see a church do is do a 5% employer contribution. That gets the person in the plan. Like the youth pastor who thinks he can't spare a dime for salary deferral, even with a match, if there's an employer contribution, it at least gets him in the plan. So if I could wave my magic wand and get every free church doing this, I would. I'd say do a 5% employer contribution and then do a 5% match so that you're in the plan at 5%, but we give you the incentive to defer 5%, up to 5% more will match. So you end up with 15%. That would be my preferred outcome, but in the free church, of course, that can't be mandated.
So you see Dale's got a question. Can you roll a 403B set up by a church that is not a church plan into one that is a church plan?
Yes, if it's already a 403B, there are a few hoops to jump through, but we can help you with that. The main thing is the IRS has some regulations that are specific to 403B plans that you can't end one plan and start another with certain terminology. So we help churches sort of freeze the prior plan and then transfer the assets, but avoid the word terminated. And again, that's due to some of the IRS matters. For a 403B plan as a church contribution, the only way funds can be added, yes. It's an employer plan. The money can only come through the employer. Now, it can be through salary deferral and through employer contribution. And if you do have money, even in an IRA or some other form of retirement plan, you can roll that in. But you can't write a check to FCMM. The same way with other 401ks, those are employer plans.
Okay, and then John's asking, he plans to retire from full-time ministry this year and work part-time. How does he keep his housing allowance?
Okay, well, so regarding your retirement money, let me make an assumption here. You're working 20 hours a week, 21 hours a week. Number one, you don't have to draw anything from your FCMM account unless you need it. But as long as you're working at least half time, you can defer having to take any money from it. Now, you probably will want to take some money. So there are two different answers for active ministry and your retirement funds. So your FCMM retirement funds, our board automatically designates 100% of anything you take out as housing allowance. Again, if they were put away while you were eligible for housing allowance. So any of that we designate. Now, if you don't use it all for housing allowance, you have to report the difference, just like you do now in active ministry years. So the rules are the same there. The only difference is you don't have to do a request each year of us. We automatically designate 100%. And it doesn't matter your status in retirement. You could be a sailor, you could be defrocked, but it's your retirement money that was put away while you were eligible for housing allowance. So you get to draw it as housing allowance in retirement.
So one question, really quickly, in terms of like risk posture, I mean, the stock market obviously has been done really well, and people should be taking advantage of that. But we get concerned because then what happens if it goes down the other way? Like, do you have any advice on how people should approach the volatility of the market regarding their retirement funds?
Yeah, a couple of things. One is have a long-term approach to it. Don't be looking at this year and last year and next year so much, but look at decades over time. Over time, investments in the market have always done better than inflation. I mean, that's the bottom line you want to do, have some gain over inflation. And sometimes they've done very well, and then they've gone way down. For example, that a 50% loss, it takes you 100% gain to recoup it. Do the math sometime. $100 becomes $50. What do you have to do for 50 to get back to 100? You have to double it. So that might make us too averse to losses, but frankly, over time, the market so far in America has proven to be beneficial. But if you look at any short period of time, 1 year, 2 years, 3 years, it can be all over the place. So number one, have the long-term objective. Keep that in mind. For many of us, that'll mean not even looking at our account that much. If you gasp when you see a loss, that may not be healthy. But if you have the long-term perspective, second, as you get closer to when you're going to draw those funds, you may need to become more conservative or more preservative of your cash, and you go more to bonds and income producing investments and less in stocks. Most of the mutual fund families, including the ones that we have, American, Vanguard, Guidestone, we have all of those mutual fund plans. They have what are called target date funds. If you're not familiar with that, it's a good concept in those mutual funds that they become automatically more conservative as you get older. So you pick a target date like 2040 and you invest in that, and that 2040 is, somewhere close to where you anticipate retiring. It's getting more and more conservative as it approaches that date. So that's on automatic pilot. Now, with FCMM's managed funds, you don't need to think about that as much, as because you're in a big pool of people. And so, our stock fund, our option D, is going to pretty well match where the general market goes each year. 13% up, 20% down, and if you're okay with that ride, that's great. Or we have the lifetime fund, which varies in a much lower range. We keep it pretty steady, but still typically well above inflation.
Okay.
So the diversity, remember the slide I said a person could put like 50% into that lifetime fund and have their steady base, and then varying levels in the stock fund or bond funds. So the main thing is diversify and have a long-term objective.
Do rollovers have to be like plans? This is David Barr's question. That is 403B to 403B and IRA to IRA.
Well, good question. And with one exception, it can be anything to anything. So a 401k can go to a 403B, vice versa. A traditional IRA can come into a retirement plan. The IRS, unfortunately, has one restriction that I don't understand, and it's that a Roth IRA cannot be rolled over to a retirement plan. And that's true of all retirement plans, not just ours. Why that, I don't know, but the bottom line is it can be from anything to anything with the exception of Roth IRA money. You can take FCMM Roth money and roll it to a Roth IRA, but you just can't do the opposite.
Bob Osborne is our director of church health. Bob, could you talk really briefly? You visit with a lot of churches and seen a lot of the back end kind of stuff. What are your thoughts about some of these things we've talked about?
Well, I can share with you what it is that I share with churches when they call and ask about compensation retirement, and I do get that question fairly frequently. But first of all, the issue usually isn't with pastors, it's with the church board. And, pastors can be really savvy about retirement and all that kind of stuff. But if their church board isn't, then oftentimes it's really hard to do, to get anything positive accomplished. But, if your church board were to reach out to EFCA West and ask about compensation, what I would tell them is, first of all, for pastors and ministry staff, the church should, if at all possible, be generous. We want pastors and ministry staff to model generosity, the same as we would teach our congregation. And so we want their salary to be generous, not exotic or, ridiculous, but certainly, very livable in that community. And we also recommend, just like Jerry said, that the church contribute to the retirement plan. And that the church plan for the pastor's retirement, even if you're a church that churns pastors every 4 or 5 years, that pastor is still going to need to retire someday and needs to have a retirement plan. And so I also encourage them to understand compensation. Maybe you call FCMM and just kind of ask about, what should we know? The other thing that I think is real important for churches, and oftentimes the church wants to grow and they talk about hiring staff, and I always just suggest, again, our quality, we can't order anything, but just suggest that churches don't hire more people than they can financially support well.
Amen.
There's always this tendency to hire one more, and we do that at the lifelong expense of the staff that we have. And it's just, oftentimes we're tempted to be, expansive in the moment, but we don't weigh the long-term cost. And then for pastors on the call, most of your board members aren't listening to this. I don't know if they would listen to it if you fed it to them, but one thing that they will never know unless you tell them is what your retirement dreams are and what you need. Board members, as a rule, are not HR professionals. They don't deal with this stuff, and they will never know unless you tell them. And so I always encourage pastors, unless your board is sick, and we have some of those, unfortunately, but unless your board is really unhealthy, you need to initiate the conversation about what your future and your family's future is going to be, because boards seldom, if ever, initiate that. And then if you have any need for conversation or anything like that about some of that practical stuff, Tim or I or really any of our team would be happy to talk with you or your board member or whoever's leading that conversation at your church, just to kind of back that play.
Yeah, and that it is helpful to have someone like Bob or Jerry to be that third party, because pastors, the board isn't necessarily going to always be, you come in and you say things like, hey, we need to be generous with our staff. That's kind of harder maybe for you to say, but easier for someone like Bob to say. Or hey, even have Jerry, I'm sure you'd be willing to make these presentations to church boards as well, because we need to educate. And I appreciate every one of you that's on this call that's a board member. That shows a lot of leadership. And I deeply appreciate that, the fact that you're on this call. That says a lot about you in terms of your desire to help our pastors. We have just a minute or two left. Jerry, is there anything in closing that you'd like to say? We'll let you get the last word in here.
Well, thanks. I do want to mention one specific thing. If you have money in a retirement account like an IRA or some previous 401k or 403b that is not eligible for housing allowance, we actually can make it housing allowance when you roll it over to us. We, on our roll-in form, we have a place for you to certify that the money was put away when you were eligible for housing allowance. So even if you were just investing in an IRA, if you certify that you put it there while you were eligible as a pastor for housing allowance, we can give it that characteristic when it comes into our plan. And so that kind of helps take care of picking up that benefit if you haven't been able to.
Great. And I think what's come through today too, and I appreciate, Jerry, the verse you put at the end of saying that God is going to supply all of our needs wherever we're at. And we've all had ups and downs, but I do think, just as a general rule, we want to be able to have our pastors, our ministry leaders be well taken care of, to plan well and to enjoy, to not have this be a stressor. There's nothing holy about not being able to pay for your kids' soccer, or you're not to be able to have basic needs met. And there's nothing holy about that. We want to be able to do what we can. And so I hope that being a part of EFCA, I mean, this is one of the main things that we're enthusiastic about, is really helping pastors and churches. This is what we do. And we're good at it. FCMM is really good at this stuff. My retirement plan is with FCMM. I'm actually in the process of rolling over mine from my previous church into. So I did that whole thing, fill out the paperwork, and it's still taking like a month or whatever to do. But I'm putting all of my eggs in that basket. So I appreciate Jerry's advice and his counsel, and he's available. They want to help you. So with that being said, I'm going to ask our church planting director, Dean Maeda, to close us in prayer. I always like to highlight our staff as I see him on the screen, and then we'll go.
That's great. Thank you, Tim. Thank you, Jerry, for all of that. And let's pray together. Father, thank you so much. You are so wonderful and gracious to us to provide us with these resources through EFCA and EFCA West. Father, we pray that there would be some board members, board chairs, just whole boards just activated to care for their pastors and the staff of their churches in a generous way, in a way that has full integrity, in a way that is caring and compassionate to their staff and families. So we give you all the praise. We're thankful. We pray that that you would take some of this, all of this, and be able to use this for your good and for your glory. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Thank you all. Don't forget, you'll be able to get this emailed to you shortly, the presentation, the PDF. And please, if you have any other follow-up questions, don't hesitate to reach out to Jerry or to us. So God bless you. Thank you very much.